The Australian Financial Review.
Last year, billionaire iron ore miner Andrew Forrest had an epiphany. He announced he was dedicating 10% of Fortescue's profits to clean energy projects, with a particular focus on green hydrogen.
He is well aware that decarbonisation is effectively an industrial revolution. Huge amounts of money are going to be made by some people. Other industries are going to crumble, have their Kodak moment. And so I think he can see that this is an astonishing opportunity for those who are willing to take a punt.
That's the Australian Financial Review's resources reporter, Peter Ker. He says that after years of being in one of the most polluting industries in the world, Forrest is changing course. He is aiming for the group's new green energy arm, Fortescue Future Industries, to be among the biggest suppliers of hydrogen. But last week, its star hire, Chief Financial Officer Guy Debelle, stepped down from the role.
9 months ago, Guy Debelle shocked the corporate world by resigning as Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank to join Andrew Forrest as Chief Financial Officer of Fortescue Future Industries. Today, Debelle made another shock as he resigned from Fortescue for health reasons.
It was the latest in a string of high-profile executive departures and a heavy blow to the credibility of Fortescue Future Industries, the world's largest and most generously funded hydrogen startup. Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, we look at the remarkable remaking of Andrew Forrest from mining magnate to green hydrogen crusader, what his plan is, and whether he can actually pull it off. It's Thursday, December 1. Pete, since setting up Fortescue almost 20 years ago, Andrew Forrest has built the company into the third biggest iron ore miner in the country and along the way has become its second richest person. But he's had an epiphany of sorts. Tell us what's happening.
It's been an incredible journey.
Here now is Dr. Andrew Forrest with the first of his lectures, Confessions of a Carbon Emitter.
So Fortescue are a big emitter, and Forrest, he is the first to admit this. A lot of his public speeches in recent years offer that up almost as an act of self-flagellation and as part of the motivation for the company's switch into clean energy.
I have a confession to make. The iron ore company I founded 18 years ago, Fortescue, generates just over 2 million tonnes of greenhouse gas every year. 2 million tonnes. That's more than the entire emissions of butane.
But around 2018, 2019, he was completing a PhD in marine biology. And he started talking through that period about how Fortescue would become big in energy. The rubber really hit the road in 2020.
In August 2020, a dedicated and determined team in the midst of COVID left Australia to visit almost 50 countries. The world was in lockdown. Economies and energy markets were collapsing. And the diaries of political leaders were eerily empty.
So the year of the pandemic, most of us were bunkered at home, maybe even locked into our 5 kilometre zone. Andrew Forrest did the opposite. He jumped in his private jet with about a dozen of his closest confidants from Fortescue, and they just toured the world, going to some of the most remote, exotic, unlikely places, just signing up options for renewable energy projects. It might be hydro in Papua New Guinea, it might be solar somewhere else. It was doing deals in the heart of Africa. We saw him in Afghanistan, and it was during this time that we later learned he caught COVID off a Russian interpreter.
I sense a change in the global mood. This shift in belief that the impossible could be possible. We could create sufficient volume of green hydrogen to challenge the oil sector. World leaders were lining up in support.
So when did he actually establish some sort of structure around these ideas, and when did he set up Fortescue Future Industries?
Yeah, so in 2020, the first year of the pandemic, while he was off on his global tours with his closest confidants, that was the year that Fortescue registered these subsidiaries called Fortescue Future Industries, and there's several that are similarly named. And we didn't really understand too much about them or take them seriously until February 2021, when Fortescue had its corporate results, the day it announced its half-year profit and its interim dividend. There was this surprise item in their accounts, which was that from now on, Fortescue will siphon 10% of all profits off to Fortescue Future Industries, which is the clean energy subsidiary. This was a massive surprise and a bit of a shock because for all the investment bank analysts and shareholders, suddenly 10% of the profit couldn't be factored into their dividend calculations. It was going somewhere else. And 2021 financial year was a record year for iron ore. It's the year that prices went above $230 a tonne. Fortescue made more than $10 billion US in profit that year. So this nascent clean energy business, which had lots of ideas but no actual projects, suddenly had $1 billion at its disposal US to play with, and safe in the knowledge that it was going to get another stipend from the iron ore mothership every year thereafter.
So before we go on to talk about how Forrest plans to spend that money, let's go back to basics. What is hydrogen? And why are we talking about it now?
Hydrogen is not new as a concept that it might play a role in energy. I remember talking to a guy who'd been in the energy industry for decades back in 2019 and saying to him, it really seems like hydrogen's going to be a big thing in the future. And he kind of smirked at me and said, people have been talking up hydrogen as the next big thing for the past 40 years. It just never seems to actually deliver. It never seems to get the traction. But now that decarbonisation is a real thing that is really being pursued by much of the world, certainly the biggest economies in the world, that seems to be the force that is going to really give hydrogen its day. So, on one hand, you can think of hydrogen as a flammable gas. In your household, you can probably think of places where you already use gases that are fossil fuels, effectively. So the stove in your kitchen, or maybe the gas bottle under your barbecue, in some cases even your car. Those are places where hydrogen can play as a carbon-free source of fuel. So that's pretty easy to understand. But it also has this other role, this industrial role as a kind of catalyst in chemical reactions. And that's going to be really important for things like the steel industry, the cement industry, and the sort of aluminium supply chain, alumina refineries. And a lot of those big chunky industrial assets, even if you power them entirely on renewables, they still have a really big carbon footprint. And that's because CO2 comes out as a chemical reaction in the process. So if you can inject hydrogen into that process, you might be able to make steel with no carbon emissions. And so Andrew Forrest, when he talks about green hydrogen, that is hydrogen that's made with zero emissions. So effectively you use renewable energy like solar and wind, you put that through a machine called an electrolyser, and that splits water into the hydrogen and oxygen constituents of water. But green hydrogen isn't a particularly common thing today. It's an expensive way of making hydrogen. As things stand today, the world's hydrogen industry is really built on fossil fuels. You can either make it from methane gas or you can make it from coal. And those types of hydrogen are where the names like blue hydrogen or grey hydrogen come from. Basically, that's hydrogen that's made from fossil fuels and either has no carbon capture attached, has some level of carbon capture attached, or is attempted to be completely decarbonised by carbon abatement.
And when does this all become real for Fortescue? When will they start producing green hydrogen? And is there even a market for it?
So the clearest timeline that Fortescue have offered us for their green hydrogen business is that they want to be making 15 million tonnes of it by 2030. Now, to put that in context, there was less than 1 million tonnes of green hydrogen made last year. So it's a pretty ambitious goal, right? Like he's planning to be making 15 times more of the stuff in just 7 years. And that's, just his segment of the market. That's assuming other people will probably be playing in this market too. In terms of when the rubber starts to hit the road, Fortescue have said that they expect revenues to start rolling into the Fortescue Future Industries subsidiary in about 2024, 2025, somewhere around there. Hydrogen, in green hydrogen, is kind of a completely new industry. What is the price of hydrogen? No one really knows. What are people going to be willing to pay for it? No one really knows. It's going to depend on what the carbon price is in any given country. Guy Debelle was talking about that just at the UBS conference, one of his last public engagements before he finished up with Fortescue. He was talking about this idea that we need to start working out what will people actually be willing to pay for green hydrogen. We talk a lot about what the cost might be, but we sort of don't know that. And we don't know who's going to buy it. We don't know how big the market is. We often hear Andrew Forrest say that green hydrogen as a market could be worth $12 trillion by 2050, but I think those are numbers that need to be taken with not just a pinch of salt, but a truckload of salt. I mean, who could honestly say, hand on heart, that they know how much green hydrogen is going to be desired by the market in 2050? Who could honestly say that they have a confident read on what the price of that hydrogen would be or the profit margin? So this is a massive step into the unknown. And I guess that's what makes it so remarkable and so exciting to watch.
So, Pete, they've got a lot going on, or they've got a lot of grand plans, but last week the Chief Financial Officer of Fortescue Future Industries, Guy Debelle, who was a pretty good hire, a former Deputy Reserve Bank Governor, he stepped down from his role, and it put the spotlight on the high executive turnover of Fortescue. What's going on there?
There's no doubt that the executive turnover at Fortescue is concerningly high. If you look back to 2 years ago at the people who were in the executive committee, the top 11 people at Fortescue, only 3 of those 11 are still in the same role. Another couple of them are still linked with the company in sort of slightly opaque ambassadorial roles. But the rest have all gone, and plenty of relatively senior people in the rungs below that have left as well. Now, as is always the case, there's a mix of reasons for some of those. So, taking Guy Debelle on his word, which, we do, he's leaving because he had a bike accident and has found it hard to recover and needs a bit of time and needs a less stressful job to help him really properly recover. But some of the others left because they were unhappy at changes that Fortescue made to the remuneration packages of executives. This really was sort of moving the goalposts mid-game. It was a surprise that these changes were made. Lots of people had stuck around based on the view that they were going to earn a certain amount of money based on the formula they were given, only to find out, midway through the game that the rules were changing. So the board's excuse for capping these executive remuneration terms was that iron ore prices had gone to record levels and the general public were very sensitive to high levels of executive pay. And given that the high iron ore prices were outside the control of the executives, they probably shouldn't be rewarded for that. This is a reasonably controversial view. So a lot of the executives left out of anger over that. And some of them left because they had trouble with projects. They were working in a projects team which had cost and schedule blowouts. So there's all sorts of different reasons, but there seems to be this common thread between all of them that Fortescue's a hard place to work these days. Andrew Forrest seems to be far more hands-on these days than he used to be. And he has many positive qualities. He's energetic, he's engaged, he's passionate, but that can also have a downside at times. And it's hard to escape the feeling that his influence is creating a chaotic, unpredictable, and for many people, unhappy working environment.
And so what do Fortescue shareholders think of Forrest's green agenda and the money he's spending on projects all around the world?
By and large, the shareholders seem to be on board with it. That's been the really surprising thing. And we also see this at the annual general meetings that Fortescue has. No one's standing up at the floor and berating Forrest. No shareholders are accusing the board of potentially killing the golden goose with this rush into clean energy. Generally, they're either supportive or apathetic. And that's going to be an important thing to remember if in a decade's time we're talking about the demise of Fortescue and how the rush into hydrogen and clean energy was all a big mistake. Investors really have been complicit. They're on board with it, and if it goes wrong, they'll be to blame too. But Andrew Forrest does still have some detractors. And some of those detractors are not the climate skeptics who you might think would attack someone going headlong into clean energy. They're people who themselves are passionate about clean energy, who are devoting their lives to decarbonisation. They're leaders in this energy transition sector, and they're not pulling punches. So a great example of this came at the AFR Energy Summit in October, when a guy called Saul Griffith stood up and really basically stole the show. This is a summit that has lots of CEOs and regulators engaging in really important talk. And Saul Griffith is an inventor, an author, an academic and a businessman. He came in, I'm told that he rode a unicycle to the event. He dropped the F-bomb on stage. Complete breath of fresh air through the whole thing. And he took aim at Andrew Forrest. Saul Griffith poured scorn on the idea that hydrogen might be a big new industry for Australia, certainly at the domestic level at least. He accused this country of recklessly or blindly buying into Andrew Forrest's hydrogen dream. And he said that, to quote him, that Australia had drunk the Kool-Aid on hydrogen.
Saul Griffith's comments really reignited the debate over hydrogen and whether it is the answer to all decarbonisation problems. Tell us a little bit about Griffith and how he became such a loud voice in the debate.
So Saul Griffith's biggest claim to fame is that he helped advise the Biden administration on the Inflation Reduction Act. This is a game-changing piece of legislation that went through the US political system in 2022. And Saul Griffith at the time was working for a mob called Rewiring America, and their ultimate argument was that electrifying everything is the fastest, cheapest, most efficient and best way to decarbonise a society. And Saul Griffith applies a very similar argument to Australia. In fact, he thinks Australia is even better equipped to electrify rather than use things like hydrogen because we already have among the world's highest penetration of rooftop solar. That means Australian homes are better prepared than homes in most other countries to electrify things, to get a battery, to charge their car at home. And so at the nub of Saul Griffith's argument is this idea that at least in the domestic energy market, where ordinary people like you and I live each day, that hydrogen's not really going to play a role there, that we will be wasting precious renewable energy if we use it to make hydrogen.
I'm concerned we miss the thing we have to do right now. We miss the thing that is going to win the game, which is electrification, if we over-focus on hydrogen. I can't say it enough, harshly enough. We have drunk the Kool-Aid and we're about to squander a decade.
We're better off taking the power that comes from those solar panels and wind turbines and putting it straight into the grid and having an oven that might work electrically and having a car that is an electric vehicle runs off a battery rather than a hydrogen fuel cell.
So if hydrogen works, I'll make more money than all of you because I built the hydrogen tanks that all of the world's automakers have licensed for doing either stationary or motion hydrogen tanks. I've shot large caliber bullets into hydrogen tanks in the desert. I've watched them explode. I've owned 2 hydrogen vehicles. It was the scariest, most horrible user experience of my life. I feel qualified to say a lot about hydrogen. I understand the physics and the thermodynamics.
Saul Griffith is not entirely anti-hydrogen. In his argument, he talked a bit about how he does believe that hydrogen could be a good export industry for Australia, particularly selling ammonia, which is a kind of proxy for hydrogen, into fertiliser markets. But he was also pretty sceptical about Andrew Forrest's plan to decarbonise his iron ore mining operations in Western Australia using hydrogen.
Right, so Andrew Forrest is wasting his money on all this.
He's already found, for example, on his train project that it's better to just do it with batteries, and with his mining vehicles it's better to just do it with batteries, and he will continue to find that to be true.
Okay. Quickly on the subject of wishful thinking, there was a...
Now, Saul Griffith remains in the minority with that view, it's worth saying. Conventional wisdom remains that ammonia and hydrogen and fuels like that are going to be the best way for big ships, big trucks, big trains and big planes to fly for the foreseeable future.
So, Pete, we spoke earlier about the high executive turnover at Fortescue. We've covered the sheer scale of what Andrew Forrest wants to do and his scattergun approach to finding renewable projects around the world. What are the other main challenges that stand in the way of his green dream?
So if you want to make lots of green hydrogen, you need lots of solar panels and lots of wind turbines or lots of hydro. We don't have much hydro here in Australia, so here it's going to be solar and wind. So Fortescue are going to have to invest a truckload in solar panels and wind turbines to make the amounts of hydrogen that they want to make. That's going to be expensive. The cost of solar panels has gone up something like 50% in the past year. But assuming that can all be done, the cost of green hydrogen is still relatively high. Most experts think it's still roughly double the cost of making hydrogen from fossil fuels. Now, they will need to find markets that are willing to pay a price that makes Fortescue's business profitable. And then there's just these technical challenges, these logistical challenges with transporting hydrogen from the place you make it to the customer. And this is particularly relevant for shipping. If hydrogen is going to be transported as pure hydrogen, we're going to need an all-new type of ship. And the first of those new types of ships actually was built in 2022. It came down from Japan, where it was made. It picked up some hydrogen made in Victoria, in Western Port Bay, turned around and carried that hydrogen at something like negative 270 degrees, carried it back to Japan. And that trial voyage was a success, but it highlights the challenge here. Someone had to go away and design a whole new ship that was capable of carrying hydrogen. And if this industry is going to boom, we're going to have to build, entire flotillas of those types of ships. And this challenge will repeat at every little step of the process. Every little component that is going to serve this industry is going to have to be built by someone. And I guess part of Andrew Forrest's plan is to own a lot of those different components.
But Pete, despite all these challenges, the demand for hydrogen is expected to surge. The International Energy Agency says it will grow 30-fold by 2030, and it predicts that Australia and the Middle East will be the dominant exporters. So doesn't that make the time, the energy, the money worth it for Andrew Forrest? And more broadly, do you think Australia can be a green energy superpower?
On face value, Australia's got as good a chance as anybody to dominate hydrogen if we choose to. If you want to dominate hydrogen, really, you're going to have really good renewable resources. And your listeners, Lisa, would probably know, we do. We've got lots of intense sunlight, we've got lots of wind, and we've got heaps of wide open space where we can harvest it. I think a sleeper issue that really isn't being talked much about at the moment is fresh water. So it might not feel like we lack fresh water in 2022 when half of Eastern Australia is suffering repeated flooding, but most years we are a dry continent. There is intense competition for water between farmers and towns and industry. As for Andrew Forrest, he's almost certainly the earliest mover. He's almost certainly the most aggressive mover. So he's got access to huge tracts of land in Western Australia. His business is putting large amounts of money into it. So I can't really see any reason why he won't succeed in hydrogen if hydrogen becomes a big thing. Perhaps this churn, these cultural problems that seem to be happening at Fortescue, perhaps that's one of the big dangers. But while hydrogen is the highest profile clean energy bet that Andrew Forrest has made, it's not the only one. And I don't think that his clean energy push will be a complete failure if hydrogen doesn't become the big industry that he thinks it will become. If you look at what he's doing, Andrew Forrest is laying bets at all these different stages of the clean energy process. So he wants to be big in hydrogen, and I think he knows that means he needs lots of electrolyzers to make hydrogen. So rather than go and make some other company rich by buying hundreds of electrolyzers, he's decided to build a factory in Gladstone to make his own. If Fortescue is going to be big in hydrogen, they know that they have to be big in solar and wind too. So Fortescue have gone and bought a controlling stake in a Dutch solar panel company. So if hydrogen fails, maybe they'll do well out of those solar panels. So they really are putting a chip on almost every number in this decarbonisation trend. So I think it really isn't all about hydrogen for them. They have many backup plans. I think Andrew Forrest is just one of the most extraordinary salesmen we've ever seen in this country. You know, iron ore was big for Andrew Forrest, but I think he can see that decarbonisation is a dramatically bigger economic opportunity. He just needs to keep Fortescue together to make it happen.
Thanks for your time, Pete.
Thank you.
Here's the other big stories we're covering this week. Andrew Forrest has lured Fiona Hick, one of the top executives at Woodside Energy, to be chief executive of Fortescue Metals Group. Her appointment comes after Elizabeth Gaines stepped down from the role earlier this year. Perth-based Hick spent 22 years at Woodside after starting her career as an engineer at Rio Tinto. And Scott Morrison was formally reprimanded by federal parliament on Wednesday for eroding public trust in Australia's democracy after he failed to disclose his 5 secret ministries. The former Prime Minister described the censure motion as an act of political intimidation and said he did what he thought was necessary to safeguard Australia during the pandemic. Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray with Peter Ker reporting today. If you want to hear more about hydrogen, check out Tech Zero, hosted by Pete, where he profiles an Australian scientist who reckons he can break green hydrogen's addiction to renewable energy. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Lap Fan. Fiona Buffini is the executive producer. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.